The conference room door clicked shut behind me, and suddenly the air felt thick. Across the polished mahogany table sat 5 board members, their faces carefully neutral, while Tyler Matthews adjusted his tie with that same arrogant gesture I remembered from when we were together. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who used to tell me I was too emotional for business decisions was now sitting in a position to make decisions about my career. "Emma, thank you for joining us," Robert Chen, our CEO, said in a tone that made my stomach drop. "As you know, we've brought Tyler on as our strategic advisor to help evaluate our operational efficiency." Tyler's eyes met mine for just a fraction of a second, and I saw something there that made my blood run cold. Not regret, not awkwardness, satisfaction. His preliminary assessment suggests some immediate restructuring is necessary. Margaret Sullivan, our board chair, continued, starting with the product management division. I felt my world tilt sideways. 6 years of building my career at Innovate Tech Solutions, 6 years of proving myself, of working late nights and weekends, of turning a struggling product line into a $50 million success story, and my ex-fiancé was about to tear it all down with a single recommendation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and 18 months ago, I thought I had my life perfectly mapped out. I was engaged to Tyler Matthews, a charming consultant with an MBA from UT Austin, and connections that seemed to stretch across every major corporation in Texas. We lived in a beautiful apartment in East Austin, planned elaborate vacations to Napa Valley, and I genuinely believed we were building something lasting together. I was also thriving professionally as a senior product manager at Innovate Tech Solutions, a growing software company that specialized in cloud-based project management tools for enterprise clients. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs that I was too in love to recognize that. Tyler had this way of making everything about himself, even my professional victories. When I landed my biggest client contract ever, a 3-year deal with a major healthcare system worth $15 million, Tyler's first response wasn't congratulations. It was a comment about how my success might make things complicated when we got married, since he was planning to start his own consulting firm and wouldn't want there to be competition in the relationship. I should have seen the red flags when he started questioning my career choices, suggesting that maybe I was too invested in work, that perhaps I should consider stepping back once we were married. He had this subtle way of undermining my confidence, making me second-guess decisions I knew were right, always framing his criticism as concern for my well-being. But I was in love, and love has a way of making you ignore the very instincts that exist to protect you. The relationship ended on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 18 months ago. I had woken up excited because I had finally worked up the courage to suggest we set a wedding date. We had been engaged for 8 months, and every time I brought up actual wedding planning, Tyler found a reason to postpone. His business was just getting off the ground, he said. Market conditions weren't ideal for a big expense, he claimed. We should wait until things stabilized, he insisted. But that Tuesday morning, I discovered the real reason Tyler had been stalling. I found texts on his phone, not intentionally snooping, but because he had asked me to check his messages while he was in the shower, looking for an important client communication. Instead, I found months of correspondence with someone named Ashley Carter, a woman who worked at his consulting firm. The messages weren't just professional, they were intimate, romantic, filled with the kind of inside jokes and shared memories that should have belonged to us. When I confronted Tyler, he didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. Instead, he turned it around on me, claiming that I had become too demanding about the wedding, that I was pressuring him into a commitment he wasn't ready for. He said Ashley understood his career ambitions in a way I never could, that she supported his goals instead of competing with them. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. He packed a bag, took his ring back, and walked out of our shared life without once looking back. I spent the next 3 months rebuilding myself from the ground up. I threw myself into work with a determination that surprised even me. I channeled all the energy I had been putting into planning our future together into driving results for Innovate Tech. My team started hitting every deadline ahead of schedule. Client satisfaction scores reached all-time highs. I developed a new feature set that increased user engagement by 47%. It was like losing Tyler had unleashed some part of me that I hadn't even known was being suppressed. By the time a full year had passed, I had not only recovered from the breakup, I had thrived beyond it. I was promoted to senior product manager with a team of 12 developers under my supervision. My product line had grown from a modest revenue stream to one of the company's most profitable divisions. I had genuine friendships with my colleagues, particularly Sarah Kim, our marketing director, who had become the sister I never had. I was up for another promotion to VP of Product Development, a role that would make me the youngest vice president in Innovate Tech's history. I genuinely thought Tyler Matthews was part of my past, a closed chapter in a story I was writing better without him. I had learned to trust my instincts again, to value my own judgment, to remember that my professional success wasn't something to be ashamed of or apologetic about. I was happy, fulfilled, and excited about my future in ways I hadn't been even when we were together. Which is why seeing him in that boardroom felt like being hit by a truck I never saw coming. Tyler looked exactly the same, tall, perfectly groomed, wearing one of those expensive suits that somehow made everyone else in the room feel underdressed. But there was something different in his demeanor now, a confidence that bordered on arrogance, like he had finally found the position of power he had always felt he deserved. He barely acknowledged me beyond a curt nod, as if our 4 years together and 8-month engagement were just a minor detail in his professional biography. Robert Chen continued the meeting with the kind of corporate speak that usually made my eyes glaze over, but today every word felt like a countdown to disaster. Tyler had been hired to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of our operational efficiency, with particular focus on redundancies and areas where the company could streamline costs. His contract was for 6 months, with the possibility of extension if his recommendations proved valuable. He would report directly to the board, not to internal management, giving him a level of access and influence that made my skin crawl. Tyler's background in strategic consulting and his fresh perspective on our industry make him uniquely qualified to identify opportunities for improvement, Margaret Sullivan explained, and I noticed the way her eyes kept drifting to Tyler with something that looked uncomfortably like admiration. His previous work with similar companies has resulted in significant cost savings and operational improvement. I wanted to stand up and scream that this man's idea of operational improvement was manipulating people into serving his agenda, that his strategic consulting amounted to emotional manipulation and self-serving politics. But this was a boardroom, not a therapy session, and my personal history with Tyler was irrelevant to his professional qualifications, or at least, that's what everyone in this room would assume. Tyler spoke for the first time since I had entered the room, and his voice carried that same smooth authority that had once made me feel safe and now made me feel nauseated. I appreciate the board's confidence in my abilities, he said, and I caught the slight emphasis he placed on the word board, as if reminding everyone in the room exactly who held the power. My initial assessment has identified several areas where Innovate Tech could significantly improve efficiency and profitability. He opened a leather portfolio that looked expensive enough to feed a family for a month, and pulled out a document that was clearly a formal presentation. While there are many strengths to build upon, there are also some concerning patterns in resource allocation and management structure that require immediate attention. I felt my heart rate spike because I knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from having lived with someone for 4 years, that whatever was in that document was going to target me specifically. Tyler had always been calculating, always strategic in his approach to conflict. He didn't believe in direct confrontation when manipulation could achieve the same result with less obvious fingerprint. The product management division, while showing strong revenue numbers, has some troubling inefficiencies in leadership and team dynamics, Tyler continued, and now his eyes found mine across the table with an expression I couldn't quite read. There are concerns about decision-making processes, communication structures, and long-term strategic alignment that could pose significant risks to the company's growth trajectory. Michael Davis, our CFO, leaned forward with interest, What kind of risks are we talking about, Tyler? The kind that aren't always visible in quarterly numbers but can undermine organizational stability over time, Tyler replied smoothly. When leadership in critical divisions operates without proper oversight or accountability, it creates vulnerabilities that competitors can exploit. It also leads to resource waste and missed opportunities that have cumulative effects on profitability. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Tyler was describing problems that didn't exist in my division, painting a picture of chaos and inefficiency that bore no resemblance to the reality of my team's performance. We had consistently exceeded targets, maintained high employee satisfaction scores, and earned recognition from clients for our responsiveness and innovation. But Tyler was presenting his assessment with the kind of confident authority that made people want to believe him, backed by credentials and a consulting fee that suggested he must know what he was talking about. What specific recommendations do you have for addressing these concerns? Robert Chen asked, and I noticed that he wasn't looking at me for my perspective on Tyler's assessment. It was as if I wasn't even in the room, as if my 6 years of experience with this company and intimate knowledge of my own division were irrelevant compared to Tyler's 6 weeks of objective analysis. I believe immediate restructuring is necessary to prevent these issues from escalating, Tyler said, and now I could see the trap he had been building. The current leadership structure and product management lacks the strategic oversight necessary for sustainable growth. My recommendation is to implement new management protocols that ensure better alignment with company objectives. Margaret Sullivan nodded thoughtfully. That sounds reasonable. What would that restructuring look like? Tyler smiled, and I recognized that expression from 1,000 arguments we had had during our relationship, the satisfied look of someone who knew he was about to win. I recommend transitioning current leadership to a more tactical role, while bringing in strategic oversight that can provide the guidance necessary for long-term success. It's a common best practice in organizations experiencing rapid growth. The corporate jargon was thick enough to cut with a knife, but the message was crystal clear. Tyler was recommending that I be demoted or removed from my leadership role, replaced by someone who would implement his vision for the department. He was using his position as strategic advisor to settle personal scores, disguising his agenda as professional expertise. Emma, we'd like to hear your thoughts on Tyler's assessment, Robert Chen said finally, and all eyes in the room turned to me. I could feel Tyler watching me particularly intently, probably curious to see how I would respond to his carefully constructed professional assassination. I took a breath and forced myself to speak calmly, even though my heart was pounding so hard I was surprised no one else could hear it. I appreciate the board's commitment to continuous improvement, I began, choosing my words carefully. However, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. However, I'm curious about the specific data points that led to these conclusions about my division's performance. Tyler's smile widened slightly. Emma, I understand this might feel like a personal criticism, but it's important to approach these evaluations objectively. The patterns I've identified are based on comprehensive analysis of operational metrics, not personal judgment. The condescension in his tone was so familiar it made my teeth ache. This was exactly how he used to dismiss my concerns during our relationship, always framing my legitimate questions as emotional overreactions, while positioning himself as the rational, objective party. But now he was doing it in front of my colleagues and supervisors, using the power dynamics of the boardroom to make me look defensive and unreasonable. Of course, I replied, keeping my voice level. I'd love to review those operational metrics with you. In my experience, data can sometimes be interpreted in multiple ways, and having the context of someone who works directly with these processes daily might provide valuable perspective. I could see Tyler's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He hadn't expected me to challenge him professionally, probably assuming that our personal history would make me too emotional or uncomfortable to advocate for myself effectively. But 18 months of rebuilding my confidence had taught me something important. I was good at my job, and I didn't need to apologize for that or defer to someone else's authority when I knew I was right. That's exactly the kind of collaborative approach we need, Michael Davis interjected, and I felt a flicker of hope that maybe not everyone in the room was ready to hand Tyler carte blanche to reorganize the company according to his personal agenda. But Margaret Sullivan was nodding approvingly at Tyler. I think Tyler's recommendations align well with our strategic goals for the coming year. Emma, we'll want you to work closely with him over the next few weeks to implement these changes. Tyler, when can you have a detailed transition plan ready for review? I can have preliminary recommendations ready by the end of this week, Tyler said confidently. Given the urgency of addressing these operational inefficiencies, I'd suggest we move quickly on implementation. The meeting concluded with handshakes and scheduling of follow-up sessions, but I barely registered any of it. As I walked back to my office, my mind was racing with the implications of what had just happened. Tyler hadn't just gotten himself hired as a strategic advisor, he had positioned himself to systematically dismantle everything I had built at Innovate Tech, and he was doing it with the full support and authority of the board, disguised as objective business strategy. I closed my office door and sat down at my desk, staring out the window at the Austin skyline while I tried to process the magnitude of the situation. Tyler knew exactly how much this job meant to me. He knew that Innovate Tech wasn't just my career, it was my identity, my security, my proof that I could build something meaningful without him. And now he was in a position to take it all away, not through any legitimate business concern, but through the kind of calculated manipulation that had made our relationship such a toxic nightmare. But as I sat there, something shifted inside me. The shock and disbelief began to crystallize into something harder, more focused. Tyler had made one critical mistake in his strategic planning. He had underestimated who I had become in the 18 months since he walked out of my life. The woman he remembered was someone who doubted herself, who deferred to his judgment, who could be manipulated into questioning her own instincts. That woman didn't exist anymore, and Tyler was about to learn that lesson in the most expensive way possible. The next morning arrived with the kind of artificial cheerfulness that only comes from corporate emails, marked as high priority. I found 3 messages waiting in my inbox, all time-stamped within minutes of each other at exactly 7 a.m. The first was from Robert Chen, requesting a comprehensive review of my division's performance metrics for the past 2 years. The second was from Margaret Sullivan, asking for detailed documentation of all current projects and their resource allocation. The third was from Tyler Matthews, suggesting we schedule a one-on-one meeting to discuss transition strategies. I stared at that last email for a full minute, reading between the lines of his professionally worded request. Tyler wanted to meet with me alone, probably expecting that familiar dynamic where he could use our shared history to manipulate me into compliance. He was counting on me being uncomfortable, emotional, maybe even grateful for his willingness to work with me directly instead of simply bulldozing over my position. I deleted his email without responding. Instead, I spent the morning doing what I did best, diving deep into data. If Tyler wanted to play the game of professional credibility, I was going to make sure I had every fact, figure, and performance metric at my fingertips. My division's numbers were exceptional, and I had the documentation to prove it. Client retention rates, project completion timelines, budget adherence, employee satisfaction scores, every measurable aspect of my team's performance painted a picture of consistent excellence. But as I compiled the data, something nagged at me. Tyler's confidence in that boardroom hadn't felt like a bluff. He had spoken with the certainty of someone who already knew the outcome of the conversation, as if my potential objections were just minor obstacles he had already planned around. That kind of assurance suggested he had information or leverage I wasn't aware of. I was deep in spreadsheet analysis when Sarah Kim knocked on my office door, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression I recognized as her investigative journalist face. Sarah had worked as a business reporter before transitioning into marketing, and she had a talent for sensing corporate intrigue that bordered on supernatural. "Okay, Spill," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk and sliding one of the coffees in my direction. "The entire executive floor is buzzing about yesterday's board meeting, and you look like someone who just discovered their ex-boyfriend is dating their sister." I almost choked on my coffee. Sarah's metaphors had a way of hitting uncomfortably close to home, even when she didn't know the full context. "What kind of buzzing are we talking about?" the kind where Lisa Thompson from HR spent 20 minutes on the phone with someone about restructuring protocols and then immediately started reviewing personnel files, the kind where Michael Davis canceled his usual Thursday golf game to work on budget projection, the kind where our new strategic advisor has already scheduled individual meetings with half the department heads. My stomach dropped. Tyler was moving fast, faster than I had anticipated. Individual meetings, tomorrow and Friday. From what I heard, he's calling them stakeholder alignment sessions, which is consultant speak for I'm about to recommend firing some of you. Sarah leaned forward, lowering her voice. Emma, there are rumors that this whole efficiency evaluation is actually preparation for a major acquisition. Word is that Pinnacle Systems has been sniffing around, and they're looking for companies with streamlined operations. Pinnacle Systems was one of the largest enterprise software companies in the country, known for acquiring smaller firms and immediately gutting their management structure. If Innovate Tech was positioning itself as an acquisition target, Tyler's recommendations would carry enormous weight with the board. A potential buyer would want assurance that any operational inefficiencies had been identified and eliminated. How solid are these rumors? I asked, though I was already mentally connecting dots that painted an increasingly troubling picture. Solid enough that people are updating their LinkedIn profiles, Sarah replied grimly. But here's the thing that doesn't make sense. Your division has the highest profit margins in the company. If someone was going to recommend cuts, logically they'd start with underperforming areas, unless, she trailed off, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. Sarah was putting together the same puzzle I was, recognizing that Tyler's recommendations weren't based on performance metrics or operational efficiency. They were personal, unless the person making recommendations has motivations that aren't purely business-related. I finished for her. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. Emma, do you know Tyler Matthews from somewhere? Because the way he looked at you in the hallway yesterday was definitely not the look of someone meeting a colleague for the first time. I had been dreading this conversation, but Sarah was too good a friend and too valuable an ally to keep in the dark. Tyler is my ex-fiancé. We were together for 4 years, engaged for 8 months. We broke up 18 months ago. The coffee cup froze halfway to Sarah's lip. Your ex-fiancé is now in a position to recommend whether you keep your job. And yesterday he essentially told the board that my division needs immediate restructuring and new leadership. Sarah set down her coffee with deliberate precision, the way she did when she was transitioning from friend mode to strategic planning mode. Emma, this isn't just a coincidence. Ex-fiancés don't accidentally end up in positions of corporate power over their former partners. This was planned. The thought had been lurking in the back of my mind since yesterday's meeting, but hearing Sarah say it out loud made it feel more real and somehow more sinister. You think he specifically targeted Innovate Tech because I work here? I think Tyler Matthews researched acquisition targets, identified companies that were likely to bring in external consultants, and positioned himself to be hired by the one where he could settle personal scores while advancing his career. Sarah's reporter instincts were in full gear now. The question is, how long has he been planning this? That question haunted me for the rest of the day. I found myself analyzing Tyler's career trajectory since our breakup, trying to identify when his path might have started converging with Innovate Tech. His consulting firm specialized in strategic assessments for mid-sized tech companies, which gave him legitimate credentials for this kind of work, but the timing felt too convenient, too perfectly aligned with my own professional success. I stayed late that evening, long after most of the office had emptied out, using the company's research databases to dig into Tyler's professional activities over the past 18 months. What I found made my blood run cold. Tyler hadn't just randomly been hired by Innovate Tech. His consulting firm had been systematically building relationships with our board members for months. William Foster, one of our newer board members, had hired Tyler's firm for a different project at his previous company just 6 months ago. Margaret Sullivan had attended a strategic planning conference where Tyler was a featured speaker. Even Robert Chen had been connected to Tyler through a mutual client relationship. Tyler had been cultivating these relationships long before Innovate Tech announced it was looking for strategic advisors. He had positioned himself perfectly to be the obvious choice when the opportunity arose. And the more I researched,
the more convinced I became that he had known exactly who he would be targeting once he got inside the company. But the smoking gun came when I found his LinkedIn activity from 8 months ago. Tyler had been researching Innovate Tech's leadership team, viewing profiles and following company updates with the kind of systematic attention that suggested professional interest rather than casual curiosity. He had been tracking my career progression, monitoring my success, and planning his intervention. I printed out the evidence and spread it across my desk like a detective working a case. The pattern was clear. Tyler hadn't stumbled into this opportunity. He had created it, methodically and deliberately, with the specific goal of undermining my professional success. The personal had become professional, and he was using corporate structures to wage a war I hadn't even known we were fighting. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced down to see Tyler's name on the screen. "Emma, I noticed you didn't respond to my email about meeting. We should talk before I finalize my recommendations. There are things we need to discuss that go beyond the profession." I stared at that message for a long time, recognizing the subtle threat embedded in his seemingly reasonable request. Tyler was reminding me that he had personal information about me, private knowledge from our relationship that he could potentially use to damage my reputation or credibility. He was offering me a chance to negotiate, to perhaps minimize the damage in exchange for cooperation or silence. A year ago, that message might have sent me into a panic. The old Emma would have worried about what Tyler might reveal, what personal details he could weaponize against me in a professional setting. But as I sat there in my empty office, surrounded by evidence of his calculated manipulation, I felt something entirely different. I felt anger, not the hot, emotional anger that leads to impulsive decisions and regrettable confrontations. This was something colder, more focused. Tyler had spent months planning this attack on my career, using our shared history and his knowledge of my professional life to position himself for maximum damage. He had turned our past relationship into a weapon, exploiting intimate knowledge for strategic advantage. But he had made one critical miscalculation. Tyler was still thinking of me as the woman who had been willing to center her life around his needs and ambition. He was expecting the version of Emma who had deferred to his judgment, who had questioned her own instincts when they conflicted with his opinions, who had been so eager to please that she had ignored red flags that should have been impossible to miss. That woman had died the day Tyler walked out of our apartment, 18 months ago. What had emerged from the ashes of that relationship was someone stronger, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous than Tyler could imagine. I deleted his text without responding, and opened a new browser window. If Tyler wanted to play corporate warfare, I was going to make sure I understood the battlefield better than he did. I started researching everything about his consulting firm, his client relationships, his professional reputation, and his business practice. If he had vulnerabilities, I was going to find them. The next morning brought Tyler's first stakeholder alignment session, and I watched from my office window as he arrived in a black BMW that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. He was dressed impeccably, carrying that same leather portfolio from the board meeting, and he moved through the lobby with the confidence of someone who owned the building. But I had spent the night learning some very interesting things about Tyler Matthews and his consulting practice. His firm had an impressive client list and equally impressive fees, but their actual track record was more complicated than their marketing materials suggested. 3 of their major strategic recommendations from the past year had resulted in lawsuits from terminated employees. 2 companies that had implemented Tyler's restructuring plans had seen significant drops in employee morale and client satisfaction, and 1 former client had quietly settled a wrongful termination suit that named Tyler's firm as a co-defendant. More importantly, I had discovered that Tyler's business partner and co-founder was Ashley Carter, the same Ashley he had been having an affair with during our engagement. Their consulting firm wasn't just his professional venture, it was their romantic partnership made corp. Every success Tyler achieved through his strategic recommendations was also a success for the woman he had left me for. That revelation added another layer of motivation to Tyler's action.
Destroying my career wasn't just about settling personal scores or proving his superiority. It was about demonstrating his value to Ashley, showing her that he could eliminate obstacles and create opportunities through pure strategic brilliance. My professional downfall would become their shared victory, proof that Tyler had made the right choice in leaving me for her. I spent the morning watching as Tyler conducted his individual meetings with department heads. Each session lasted exactly 45 minutes, and I could see people's faces when they emerged from the conference room. Some looked confused, others worried, a few appeared angry, but most just looked tired, as if they had spent 3/4 of an hour being lectured about deficiencies they hadn't known existed. My own meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock, the last appointment of the day. Tyler had probably saved me for last deliberately, knowing that I would spend the entire morning anticipating the encounter and building up anxiety about what he might say or reveal. It was a psychological tactic, designed to put me at a disadvantage before the conversation even began. But I had a few psychological tactics of my own. At exactly 2 o'clock, I walked into the conference room carrying a folder that contained every piece of evidence I had gathered about Tyler's systematic campaign against Innovate Tech, and my position specifically. I also carried a digital recorder, which I placed prominently on the table between us. "Emma," Tyler said, standing to greet me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you for making time for this conversation. I think it's important that we clear the air about a few things." "I agree completely," I replied, settling into my chair and opening my folder. "I think transparency is essential in situations like this. That's why I'm recording our conversation, for accuracy and accountability." Tyler's smile faltered slightly. He clearly hadn't expected me to take control of the meeting from the first moment, and the presence of the recorder had obviously thrown off whatever script he had prepared. "That seems a bit formal for a preliminary discussion," he said, trying to regain his composure. "Given that your preliminary assessment has already resulted in board-level discussions about restructuring my division, I think formality is appropriate," I replied. "I want to make sure we both have an accurate record of this conversation, especially since it could impact personnel decisions." Tyler sat down slowly, and I could see him recalibrating his approach. He had come into this meeting expecting to leverage our personal history and his position of authority to manipulate me into compliance. Instead, he was facing someone who was treating him like exactly what he was, a potential threat to be documented and defended against. "Emma, I understand that my recommendations might feel personal, but I want you to know that my assessment is based purely on operational metrics and strategic considerations," Tyler began, falling back on the same corporate speak he had used in the board meeting. "Which operational metrics specifically?" I asked, pulling a spreadsheet from my folder. "Because I've compiled comprehensive performance data for my division, and I'm curious about any discrepancies between my numbers and yours." Tyler's confidence flickered again. He had clearly expected this conversation to focus on personal dynamics and emotional manipulation, not hard data and professional accountability. "The metrics I'm referring to involve more complex organizational dynamics that aren't always reflected in basic performance statistics, such as leadership effectiveness, team cohesion, strategic alignment with company objectives." Tyler was improvising now, using vague terminology that sounded impressive but meant nothing specific. "Do you have quantitative measures for any of those assessments?" I pressed. "Employee satisfaction surveys, 360-degree feedback reports, strategic goal achievement rates." "Emma, you're missing the point," Tyler said, and now I could hear irritation creeping into his voice. "This isn't about attacking your competence. It's about positioning the company for future growth opportunities. Future growth opportunities like the potential acquisition by Pinnacle Systems." Tyler went very still. I could see him trying to figure out how much I knew and how I had learned it. "I'm not sure what you're referring to." "I'm referring to the acquisition discussions that have been driving this entire efficiency evaluation process," I said calmly. "The same discussions that would make your strategic recommendations extremely valuable to both Innovate Tech's board and your own consulting firm's reputation. My recommendations are based on what's best for Innovate Tech, not what's best for my firm," Tyler replied, but his tone had shifted from confident to defensive. "Including the recommendation to restructure the division that happens to be led by your ex-fiancé. The division that also happens to be the most profitable in the company." Tyler's mask slipped completely for just a moment, and I saw something ugly flash across his face. Anger, frustration, maybe even a hint of panic. He had underestimated me again, assuming that I would be too emotional or too intimidated to challenge him directly on the obvious conflict of interest in his position. "I think you're reading too much into coincidences," he said finally. "My personal history with you doesn't factor into my professional assessments." "Then you won't mind if I share that personal history with the board, along with the timeline of how you positioned yourself to be hired for this role," I replied. "Transparency is important in situations like this, don't you think?" Tyler stared at me across the table, and I could see him realizing that this conversation wasn't going according to any plan he had imagined. The woman sitting across from him wasn't the Emma he remembered, wasn't someone he could manipulate or intimidate or charm into submission. She was someone new, someone who had learned from their shared history and grown stronger because of it. "What exactly are you suggesting, Emma?" he asked quietly. "I'm suggesting that your recommendations to the board include a significant conflict of interest that should be disclosed. I'm also suggesting that your assessment of my division's performance doesn't align with objective data, which raises questions about the motivations behind your conclusions. And if I don't change my recommendation," I smiled, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt genuinely confident about the outcome. "Then you'll discover that the woman you left 18 months ago isn't the same person you're dealing with now. And Tyler, I promise you won't enjoy that education." Tyler left that conference room looking like someone who had just realized he was playing chess against a grandmaster when he had expected checkers. But I knew better than to celebrate premature. Men like Tyler didn't surrender easily, and cornering them often made them more dangerous, not less. He would regroup, recalculate, and come back with a different strategy. I didn't have to wait long to see what that strategy would look like. The next morning brought an email from Margaret Sullivan requesting an emergency board meeting to discuss urgent operational concerns that had come to light during the strategic assessment process. The meeting was scheduled for that afternoon, giving me exactly 4 hours to prepare for whatever bomb Tyler was planning to drop. I spent those 4 hours doing what had become my specialty, building an unassailable case based on facts, data, and documentation. I compiled client testimonials, employee performance reviews, and financial projections that painted an irrefutable picture of my division's value to the company. I also prepared a comprehensive timeline of Tyler's involvement with Innovate Tech, including his cultivation of board relationships and his strategic positioning to be hired for this role. But I also did something else. I reached out to Patricia Wilson, my former mentor who had left Innovate Tech 2 years earlier to start her own consulting practice. Pat was one of the smartest business strategists I had ever known, and she had connections throughout the Austin tech community that rivaled Tyler's. If anyone could help me understand the broader context of what was happening, it was her. "Emma, darling, I've been wondering when you'd call," Pat said when she answered her phone. "Word travels fast in this industry, and Tyler Matthews's involvement with Innovate Tech has raised some eyebrows." "What kind of eyebrows?" "The kind that belong to people who remember his previous work. Tyler's firm has a reputation for aggressive cost-cutting recommendations that prioritize short-term savings over long-term stability. They're also known for targeting successful women executives with particular enthusiasm." My blood chilled. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Tyler Matthews has made a career out of identifying high-performing women in leadership roles and finding creative reasons to recommend their removal. It's subtle enough to avoid discrimination lawsuits, but the pattern is unmistakable if you know what to look for." Pat's words hit me like a physical blow. Tyler wasn't just targeting me because of our personal history. He was targeting me because I fit a professional profile he had perfected over years of consulting work. The personal vendetta was just an added bonus to his standard operating procedure. "Pat, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you think the board will listen if I present evidence of Tyler's bias and conflicts of interest?" There was a long pause before Pat answered. "Emma, the board hired Tyler because they want to believe his recommendations. If Innovate Tech is positioning itself for acquisition, They need someone to identify cuts that will make the company more attractive to buyers. Tyler gives them cover to make difficult decisions by providing expert justification for actions they probably want to take anyway. So you're saying it doesn't matter how strong my case is. I'm saying you need more than a strong case. You need leverage. That word, leverage, echoed in my mind as I prepared for the emergency board meeting. Tyler had leverage in the form of his consulting credentials and his relationships with board members. I needed to find leverage of my own, something that would make it more expensive for the board to side with Tyler than to support me. The boardroom felt different that afternoon, charged with a tension that hadn't been present during our previous meeting. Tyler was already seated when I arrived, looking perfectly composed except for a slight tightness around his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept well. Margaret Sullivan called the meeting to order with an efficiency that felt ominous. Tyler has brought some additional concerns to our attention that require immediate discussion, she began. Tyler, would you like to present your findings? Tyler stood, opening that same leather portfolio with deliberate precision. Thank you, Margaret. During my continued assessment, I've uncovered some troubling patterns that go beyond the operational inefficiencies I initially identified. He pulled out a document that looked official and damning. My investigation into the product management division has revealed several concerning incidents that suggest problems with professional judgment and decision-making processes. I felt my stomach drop, but I forced myself to remain calm. Tyler was escalating his attack, moving beyond vague assessments of organizational efficiency to specific allegations about my professional conduct. What kind of incidents? Chen asked, leaning forward with obvious concern. Budget overruns that were concealed from upper management, unauthorized client commitments that exceeded approved parameters, and personnel decisions that appear to have been made based on personal relationships rather than professional qualification. Each allegation was carefully constructed, serious enough to justify my removal, vague enough to be difficult to refute without extensive documentation. Tyler had clearly spent time crafting accusations that would sound credible to people who weren't familiar with the day-to-day operations of my division. These are serious allegations, Michael Davis said, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Emma, how do you respond to these concerns? I stood slowly, pulling my own folder from my briefcase. But instead of immediately defending against Tyler's accusations, I decided to go on the offensive. Before I address those specific claims, I think the board deserves to understand the full context of this situation, I said, meeting each board member's eyes in turn. Tyler Matthews is not just a strategic consultant with an objective perspective on our operation. He is my former fiancé, and his involvement with Innovate Tech represents a clear conflict of interest that should have been disclosed from the beginning. The room went very quiet. I could see surprise and concern flickering across several faces, while others looked like they were trying to figure out the implications of this revelation. Furthermore, I continued, Tyler's firm has a documented pattern of targeting successful women executives for removal, often using similar allegations of professional misconduct that are difficult to disprove. This isn't strategic consulting, it's systematic discrimination disguised as business optimization. Tyler's composure cracked slightly. Emma, that's a serious accusation that has no basis in fact. Really? I pulled a sheet of paper from my folder. Because I have documentation showing that your firm has recommended the removal of female executives in 73% of your strategic assessments over the past 3 years. I also have statements from former clients detailing how those recommendations were justified using remarkably similar language to what you've presented today. Margaret Sullivan looked uncomfortable. Tyler, were you planning to disclose your personal relationship with Emma? I didn't feel it was relevant to my professional assessment, Tyler replied, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Not relevant? I asked. You systematically cultivated relationships with our board members for months before being hired. You researched our company's leadership structure and specifically targeted an organization where you could impact my career. And you've now presented allegations against me that follow the exact same pattern you've used to remove other women executives. How is any of that not relevant? Chen looked troubled. Tyler, Is there any truth to Emma's claims about your firm's track record with female executives? Tyler hesitated for just a moment too long. Our recommendations are always based on operational merit, regardless of gender. That's not what I asked, Robert pressed. Have you disproportionately recommended the removal of women executives? Statistics can be misleading without proper context, Tyler replied, falling back on consultant speak when direct answers became uncomfortable. I seized the opening. The context is that Tyler's firm profits from creating corporate chaos and then positioning themselves as the solution. They target successful executives, manufacture crises around their leadership, and then recommend their own people for the resulting vacancy. It's a business model based on professional destruction. William Foster, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. Tyler, you came highly recommended, but if there are questions about potential conflicts of interest or discriminatory practices, we need to address those concerns. Tyler's careful composure was beginning to crumble. I understand the board's concerns, but I stand behind my assessment of the operational inefficiencies in Emma's division. Personal history doesn't change objective performance metrics. Then let's examine those objective performance metrics, I said, pulling out my comprehensive data analysis. Because my division has consistently exceeded every measurable performance indicator for the past 3 years. I walked them through the numbers: revenue growth, client satisfaction scores, project completion rates, employee retention, budget adherence. Every metric told the same story of consistent excellence and continuous improvement. Tyler's allegations of budget overruns and unauthorized commitments fell apart under scrutiny, revealed as mischaracterizations of standard business practices that he had deliberately misrepresented. Tyler, these numbers seem to contradict your assessment, Michael Davis observed. Can you explain the discrepancy? Tyler was trapped, caught between his false allegations and the undeniable evidence of my division's success. Performance metrics don't capture all aspects of organizational health, he said weakly. What aspects aren't captured? Margaret Sullivan asked. Tyler fumbled for an answer, clearly not expecting to have his vague assertions challenged so directly. Leadership style, team dynamics, strategic vision alignment. Do you have any quantitative measures for those assessments? I asked, echoing the same question I had posed during our private meeting. Not all organizational factors can be quantified, Tyler replied, but he was clearly losing ground. Patricia Wilson's advice about needing leverage suddenly crystallized into a clear strategy. I had been defending against Tyler's attacks when I should have been exposing his vulnerabilities. Board members, I need to share something else, I said, pulling out my final piece of documentation. Tyler's consulting firm is co-owned by Ashley Carter, the woman he left me for during our engagement. Every success Tyler achieves through his recommendations directly benefits the person he had an affair with while we were planning our wedding. The room erupted in uncomfortable murmur. This wasn't just about professional conflicts of interest anymore, it was about personal ethics, and the credibility of someone who would weaponize corporate structures to settle romantic scores. This goes beyond conflict of interest, Robert Chen said grimly. Tyler, I think we need to seriously reconsider your role in this process. Tyler's mask slipped completely, revealing the desperation underneath his polished exterior. You're making a mistake if you let personal drama override strategic business decisions. This company needs optimization, whether you like my methods or not. What we need, Margaret Sullivan said firmly, is objective assessment from consultants who don't have personal vendettas against our employees. Tyler looked around the room, probably realizing that his carefully constructed plan was collapsing in real time. If you terminate my contract, you'll be missing an opportunity to address serious operational problems that will eventually cost you millions. The only serious operational problem I see, William Foster said, is a consultant who failed to disclose massive conflicts of interest and appears to have used his position to pursue personal grievances. The vote to terminate Tyler's contract was unanimous. As Tyler packed up his materials, his eyes met mine across the table. The fury I saw there was unmistakable, and I realized that while I had won this battle, the war was far from over. Tyler Matthews wasn't the type of man who accepted defeat gracefully,
and he still had resources and connections that could be used against me. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was fighting from a position of strength instead of defending from a position of weakness. Tyler had underestimated me once again, and that mistake was going to cost him everything he had worked to build. Tyler's departure from the building that afternoon should have felt like victory, but I knew better than to celebrate yet. As I watched him load his materials into that black BMW, I could see the rigid set of his shoulders and the deliberate control in his movements. Tyler was angry, humiliated, and now financially damaged by the termination of his contract. Men like him didn't simply disappear quietly into the night. I was right to be cautious. The first sign of retaliation came 48 hours later, delivered through the seemingly innocent medium of industry gossip. Sarah burst into my office Friday morning with her laptop open to Tech Austin Daily, a popular industry blog that covered local technology companies. "Emma, you need to see this," she said, turning the screen toward me. The article was titled "Consulting Controversies: When Personal Vendettas Masquerade as Professional Assessment." It didn't mention Innovate Tech by name, but anyone familiar with recent Austin tech industry developments would recognize the situation immediately. The piece painted a picture of a vindictive female executive who had used false accusations of bias to destroy the career of a respected consultant, all to avoid accountability for legitimate performance concerns. The article was devastatingly well written, using just enough truth to make the lies seem credible. It acknowledged that Tyler and I had a personal history, but framed that history as ancient grievances that I had weaponized against honest business criticism. It suggested that my allegations of systematic discrimination were desperate attempts to deflect from real operational problems. Most damaging of all, it implied that my actions had cost Innovate Tech valuable strategic guidance that could have positioned the company for significant growth. "This is character assassination," Sarah said grimly, "and it's being shared all over social media. Half the tech community in Austin has probably seen this by now." I read through the article again, analyzing the language and approach with the kind of clinical detachment that comes from having survived corporate warfare. Tyler hadn't written this himself. The style was too polished, too strategically crafted. He had hired a professional, probably someone with connections to tech industry media, to systematically destroy my reputation. "The worst part," Sarah continued, "is that people are going to assume this is about Innovate Tech even though we're not named. Your reputation is getting shredded, and our company is being portrayed as dysfunctional." She was right. The article was brilliant in its maliciousness, designed to damage both my personal credibility and Innovate Tech's professional standing without making any specific claims that could be legally challenged. Tyler was playing a longer game than I had anticipated, one that extended beyond our individual conflict to potentially harm the company that had chosen to support me over him. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Reputation is everything in this industry, Emma. Hope you've thought carefully about the consequences of your choices." I showed the message to Sarah, who immediately started typing on her laptop. "I'm doing reverse image searches and metadata analysis on every photo used in that article. If Tyler hired someone to write this hit piece, there might be digital fingerprints we can trace." While Sarah worked her investigative magic, I focused on damage control. The article was already spreading through industry networks, and I needed to get ahead of the narrative before it solidified into accepted truth. I started making calls to former colleagues, clients, and industry contacts, not to defend myself directly but to remind them of my track record and professional accomplishments. But Tyler's strategy was more sophisticated than simple reputation destruction. Over the weekend, I discovered that he had been reaching out to Innovate Tech's clients directly, offering strategic consulting services, while subtly suggesting that our company was experiencing leadership instability that could affect service delivery. The first client inquiry came Monday morning. Janet Morrison from Meridian Healthcare called Robert Chen to ask whether the management changes at Innovate Tech would impact our contract obligation. She had been contacted by Tyler's firm with an offer to provide continuity planning services, supposedly to help Meridian navigate any disruptions in our partnership. Tyler was systematically attacking every aspect of my professional life, my industry reputation, my company's stability, and my client relationships. It was psychological warfare disguised as business development, and it was work. This ends now, I told Sarah as we sat in my office that Monday afternoon, surrounded by printouts of Tyler's various attacks and their spreading consequences. Tyler wants to play dirty, fine, but he's about to learn that I've gotten very good at this game. I spent the next several days doing something I had never done before, conducting opposition research on Tyler Matthews with the thoroughness of a private investigator. If he wanted to weaponize information against me, I was going to find every piece of ammunition I could use against him. What I discovered was a pattern of professional misconduct that went far beyond the systematic targeting of female executives I had already exposed. Tyler's consulting firm had been involved in 3 separate client disputes over the past 2 years, all involving allegations of overcharging, misrepresentation of qualifications, or failure to deliver promised results. 2 of those disputes had been settled out of court with confidentiality agreements, but the third was still pending in Dallas County. More importantly, I found evidence that Tyler had been violating the terms of his consulting agreements by using confidential client information to pursue business opportunities with competitors. He had a pattern of learning about companies' strategic plans during consulting engagements, then using that knowledge to position his firm for contracts with rival organizations. But the most damaging discovery came when I traced the financing behind Tyler's consulting firm. Ashley Carter might have been listed as co-founder, but the primary investor was a shell company that traced back to a larger consulting conglomerate known for aggressive acquisition tactics. Tyler wasn't just running a small strategic consulting practice, he was essentially a front operation for a company that specialized in destabilizing mid-sized businesses to make them vulnerable to hostile takeovers. The pieces clicked together with terrifying clarity. Tyler's involvement with Innovate Tech wasn't just about settling personal scores or even advancing his own career. The revelation about Tyler's financial backing hit me like ice water. This wasn't just personal revenge or professional sabotage. It was corporate espionage on a scale I hadn't imagined possible. Tyler had been positioned inside Innovate Tech as part of a larger strategy to weaken our company for acquisition, and my removal was just one component of a systematic dismantling process. I sat in my car outside the downtown law offices of Rivera and Associates, gripping my steering wheel while I processed the magnitude of what I had uncovered. James Rivera had been recommended by Patricia Wilson as someone who specialized in corporate fraud cases, particularly those involving consulting firms that operated beyond ethical boundaries. The manila envelope on my passenger seat contained everything I had discovered about Tyler's true role and the shadow organization backing his firm. The law office occupied 2 floors of a sleek glass building, and James Rivera turned out to be exactly what I needed. A sharp-eyed attorney in his 40s who had built his reputation taking on white-collar criminals who thought they were too clever to get caught. He listened to my story with the kind of focused attention that told me he was already identifying legal strategies and potential outcomes. "Emma, what you're describing goes far beyond workplace harassment or personal retaliation," he said after I had finished presenting my evidence. "If Tyler Matthews was placed inside Innovate Tech as part of a coordinated effort to destabilize your company for acquisition purposes, we're looking at securities fraud, corporate espionage, and potentially racketeering charges." The legal terminology felt surreal. 6 months ago I had been planning my wedding to Tyler, worrying about flower arrangements and seating charts. Now I was sitting in a lawyer's office discussing federal crimes that could send my former fiancé to prison. "The question," Rivera continued, "is whether you want to pursue this through civil litigation or criminal referral. Civil action would focus on damages to you personally and to Innovate Tech. Criminal referral would involve federal investigators and could result in prosecutions that go far beyond Tyler's individual actions." I thought about Tyler's text message, his threat about reputation being everything in our industry. He had been counting on my reluctance to escalate, assuming that I would accept the damage to my career rather than risk a prolonged legal battle that could attract unwanted attention. Tyler had always underestimated my willingness to fight when cornered. "I want both," I told Rivera. civil action to recover damages and protect my career, criminal referral to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else.
Rivera smiled with the satisfaction of a prosecutor who had just been handed a case with overwhelming evidence. In that case, we're going to need to document everything systematically and build a timeline that shows intent and coordination. This is going to be a complex investigation, but I think we can make a very compelling case. Over the next week, my life transformed into something resembling a legal thriller. Rivera connected me with a forensic accountant who specialized in tracing shell company finances, a cybersecurity expert who could analyze digital communications for evidence of coordination, and a private investigator who began mapping the network of relationships between Tyler's firm and the larger consulting conglomerate. The investigation revealed layers of deception that went back almost 2 years. Tyler's firm had been systematically targeting mid-sized tech companies throughout Texas, using the same pattern of infiltration, destabilization, and recommendation for restructuring that would make them attractive acquisition targets. Innovate Tech was just the latest in a series of companies that had been methodically weakened from within, but Tyler had made one critical mistake in targeting me specifically. His personal vendetta had led him to create a paper trail of communications that revealed the true nature of his mission. Text messages with Ashley Carter about eliminating obstacles to their business plans. Emails with his financial backers about accelerating the timeline for Innovate Tech's vulnerability. Consulting reports that used identical language across multiple client engagements, suggesting a standardized approach to corporate sabotage. The evidence was overwhelming, but Rivera warned me that Tyler wouldn't go down without a fight. Men like Matthews don't just surrender when exposed, he said during one of our strategy sessions. They tend to escalate, sometimes in ways that can be dangerous for the people who threaten their operations. He was right. Tyler's retaliation intensified as word began spreading through legal and business circles that serious allegations were being prepared against his firm. The industry blog attacks expanded to include social media campaigns and what appeared to be coordinated efforts to damage Innovate Tech's client relationships. But Tyler's most vicious attack was also his most personal. He somehow obtained access to photos and private communications from our relationship, which he weaponized in a campaign designed to humiliate me professionally and personally. Anonymous social media accounts began posting intimate details about our relationship, always framed as evidence of my unstable personality and poor judgment. The violation felt worse than anything Tyler had done to my career. He was taking moments that had once been precious to me, private jokes, vulnerable conversations, intimate photographs, and turning them into weapons designed to destroy my credibility and reputation. It was psychological warfare at its most brutal, and it was taking a toll on my mental health in ways that corporate battles never had. Sarah found me crying in my office one afternoon after a particularly vicious series of posts had been shared across multiple platforms. "Emma, this is too much," she said firmly. "No job is worth this kind of abuse." But giving up wasn't an option anymore. I had uncovered evidence of criminal activity that went far beyond my personal situation. Other women, other companies, other careers had been destroyed by Tyler's systematic approach to corporate manipulation. Walking away would mean abandoning all of them to protect myself from further attacks. "I'm not quitting," I told Sarah. "Tyler is counting on me being too embarrassed or too afraid to keep fighting. But every day I don't fight back is another day he gets to destroy someone else's life." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Ashley Carter, Tyler's business partner and romantic partner, reached out to me through a mutual acquaintance with a message that changed everything. The meeting took place in a coffee shop in South Austin, far from the downtown business district where either of us might be recognized. Ashley was younger than I had expected, probably in her late 20s, with the kind of polished appearance that screamed ambitious professional, but she also looked exhausted, stressed in a way that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. "I need to tell you something about Tyler," she said without preamble, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup like it was anchoring her to sanity, "about what he's really been doing, and what he's planning to do next." I sat across from her, remembering that this was the woman Tyler had left me for, the person who had destroyed my engagement and shattered my faith in love. But looking at her now, I saw something I hadn't expected. Fear. "Tyler isn't just targeting you professionally," Ashley continued. "He's obsessed with destroying you completely, The business with Innovate Tech was supposed to be quick and clean. But when you fought back, it became personal for him in ways that are scaring me. She pulled out her phone and showed me a series of text messages that made my blood run cold. Tyler hadn't just been coordinating corporate sabotage, he had been researching my personal life, my family, my friends, looking for pressure points he could exploit to force me into submission. "He's planning to go after your family next," Ashley said quietly. "Your parents, your sister, anyone who matters to you. Tyler thinks if he can make the cost of fighting him high enough, you'll eventually surrender." The messages she showed me detailed investigations into my family's financial situation, my sister's small business, my parents' retirement plans. Tyler had been systematically mapping my personal vulnerabilities, preparing to wage war against everyone I cared about. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, still trying to process the scope of Tyler's planned escalation. Ashley looked out the window, watching traffic pass on South Lamar. "Because I thought I was getting involved with someone who was ambitious and strategic. I didn't realize I was dating a sociopath who gets pleasure from destroying people's lives." She turned back to me, and I saw genuine remorse in her eyes. "Emma, Tyler told me you were holding him back during your relationship, that you were threatened by his success and tried to undermine his career. He made me believe that everything he was doing to you was justified self-defense, and now I've seen how he operates when he doesn't get his way. The same tactics he's using against you, he's starting to use against me when I question his methods. I'm scared of what he might do if I try to leave." That admission revealed the final piece of Tyler's psychological profile. He wasn't just a corporate manipulator. He was someone who used control and intimidation in all his relationships. Ashley hadn't been his willing partner in destroying my life. She had been another victim of his systematic approach to domination. "I have recordings," Ashley said, pulling out a small device. "Conversations where Tyler admits to falsifying reports, planning character assassination campaigns, coordinating with his financial backers to target specific companies. I started recording him when I realized how dangerous he was becoming." The recordings Ashley provided were devastating. Tyler speaking casually about eliminating obstacles like he was discussing the weather, planning attacks on my reputation with the clinical detachment of a military strategist, laughing about the pain he was causing, treating other people's destroyed lives as entertainment. But the most damaging recording was Tyler explaining his true motivation to someone I didn't recognize. "Emma always thought she was smarter than me, more ethical, more deserving of success. I want her to understand that none of that matters when you're dealing with someone who's willing to go further than you are. I want her to know that leaving me was the biggest mistake of her life." It wasn't about business or corporate strategy, or even financial gain. It was about Tyler's injured ego, his need to prove that he could destroy someone who had dared to reject him. Everything else, the systematic targeting of other women, the corporate espionage, the financial fraud, was just the method he had chosen to wage his personal war against me. Rivera's reaction to Ashley's recordings was immediate and decisive. "This changes everything," he said after listening to the most incriminating conversations. "We're not just looking at corporate fraud anymore, we're looking at stalking, harassment, potentially criminal conspiracy." Tyler Matthews has graduated from white-collar crime to something much more serious. The federal investigation that followed moved with surprising speed. Tyler's phone records, financial transactions, and digital communications painted a picture of criminal activity that extended far beyond his vendetta against me. The consulting conglomerate backing his firm had been operating a nationwide scheme to destabilize companies for acquisition, using methods that violated multiple federal statutes. Tyler was arrested on a Tuesday morning, taken into custody at his downtown office, while trying to delete files from his computer. The news spread through Austin's tech community like wildfire, and suddenly everyone who had read those anonymous blog posts attacking my character understood the real story behind the propaganda campaign. But Tyler's arrest was just the beginning. The investigation revealed that his systematic targeting of successful women executives had been even more extensive than I had imagined. Over 3 years, his firm had been responsible for the termination or resignation of 47 female leaders across 12 states. Some had been driven out through false performance evaluations, others had been destroyed through character assassination campaigns, a few had been intimidated into resignation through threats against their family. I found myself at the center of a federal case that was being called one of the most sophisticated corporate espionage operations ever uncovered. Media coverage transformed me from Tyler's victim into the whistleblower who had exposed a nationwide criminal conspiracy. The personal attacks that had once threatened to destroy my reputation became evidence of Tyler's desperation and malicious intent. Ashley Carter accepted a plea deal in exchange for her cooperation with federal investigators. Her testimony revealed the full scope of Tyler's organization and provided prosecutors with the evidence they needed to pursue charges against the larger consulting conglomerate. She also entered a victim protection program, acknowledging that Tyler's associates might target her for her cooperation. The resolution took 18 months, but when it was complete, Tyler Matthews was facing federal charges that would likely result in a 20-year prison sentence. His consulting firm was shut down, his financial assets were frozen, and his professional reputation was destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery. Innovate Tech not only survived the attempted sabotage but emerged stronger than before. The publicity surrounding the case attracted positive attention from clients who appreciated our company's commitment to ethical business practice. My division became a model for other organizations dealing with similar threats, and I was promoted to Vice President of Product Development with expanded responsibilities for corporate security. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a handwritten letter from Tyler in federal custody. It was a rambling, desperate attempt to justify his actions, filled with the same manipulative language he had always used to avoid responsibility for his choices. He claimed that everything he had done was motivated by love, that his attacks on my career were his twisted way of trying to win me back. I read the letter once, then fed it into my office shredder without responding. Tyler Matthews had spent 2 years trying to destroy my life, and in the end, he had only succeeded in destroying his own. The woman he had tried to break had become stronger, more successful, and infinitely happier than she had ever been when she was planning to marry him. Justice, I realized, wasn't just about Tyler facing consequences for his crimes, it was about me discovering that I was capable of surviving anything life threw at me, and that the future I built for myself would always be better than any future someone else tried to impose on me. 3 years had passed since Tyler's arrest, and I was standing in the executive conference room of the Austin Convention Center, preparing to deliver the keynote address at the Southwest Technology Leadership Summit. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to speak to an audience of nearly 2,000 business leaders about corporate ethics and whistleblower protection, topics that had once seemed like abstract concepts from business school rather than lived experiences that had nearly destroyed my life. My speech that day was titled "When Strategy Becomes Sabotage: Recognizing and Combating Corporate Espionage," and it had been requested specifically because of my role in exposing what prosecutors had called the most sophisticated corporate infiltration scheme in modern business history. What had started as my personal nightmare with Tyler Matthews had evolved into a federal case study that was now taught in law schools and business programs across the country. The audience included CEOs, board members, and senior executives from companies throughout the Southwest, many of whom had been targets of similar infiltration attempts since Tyler's network had been exposed. Federal investigators had discovered that the consulting conglomerate backing Tyler's firm had been operating in 14 states, with active operations against more than 60 companies at the time of the arrest. As I looked out at the faces in the audience, I recognized several people whose companies had been saved from destruction by the investigation my case had triggered. Janet Morrison from Meridian Healthcare was there, along with executives from 3 other companies that had been on Tyler's target list. They represented millions of dollars in prevented damage and hundreds of careers that had been protected from systematic destruction. But the most meaningful presence in the audience was a group of women executives who had formed an informal support network after the federal case concluded. These were the 47 women whose careers had been targeted by Tyler's organization,
along with dozens more who had experienced similar attacks from other consulting firms using the same playbook. What had begun as a victims advocacy group had evolved into a powerful professional network that now influenced hiring practices and corporate governance policies throughout the technology industry. Dr. Linda Vasquez, the former CTO of a San Antonio software company who had been one of Tyler's earliest targets, had become the unofficial leader of this group. She had reached out to me during the federal investigation, sharing her own story of how Tyler's firm had systematically undermined her authority, spread false rumors about her technical competence, and ultimately pressured her company's board to terminate her employment. Linda's case had been particularly devastating because she had never understood what was happening to her until it was too late. Tyler's methods had been so sophisticated, his manufactured evidence so convincing, that she had begun to doubt her own abilities and judgment. She had left her position believing that she had failed as a leader, carrying that psychological damage for years before learning that she had been the victim of an orchestrated campaign of professional destruction. During my keynote address, I spoke directly about Linda's experience and the experiences of the other women who had been targeted. Corporate sabotage disguised as strategic consulting represents one of the most insidious forms of discrimination in modern business. I told the audience, it weaponizes legitimate business processes against successful individuals, using the authority and credibility of external consultants to justify actions that would be obviously discriminatory if implemented by internal management. The speech generated a standing ovation and led to a series of follow-up presentations at corporate conferences and business schools. But more importantly, it sparked conversations about the need for stronger protections against the kind of systematic targeting that Tyler's organization had perfected. 6 months after that keynote address, I received a call that would define the next phase of my career. Margaret Sullivan, who had remained as board chair at Innovate Tech throughout the federal investigation and its aftermath, had been approached by a coalition of technology companies about establishing an industry-wide initiative to combat corporate espionage and protect executive leadership from targeted attack. Emma, your experience has given you unique insight into how these operations work, Margaret explained during our meeting in her downtown office. The coalition wants to establish a consulting firm that specializes in detecting and preventing the kind of infiltration that Tyler's organization was conducting. They want you to lead it. The proposal was both flattering and terrifying. The coalition was offering me the opportunity to build a consulting practice from the ground up, with initial funding from 12 major technology companies and a mandate to develop industry standards for protecting corporate leadership from systematic targeting. It would mean leaving Innovate Tech, where I had rebuilt my career and found my professional identity, to venture into entirely uncharted territory. But it would also mean transforming my personal nightmare into a mission that could protect other people from experiencing what Tyler had put me through. The consulting firm I would build wouldn't just identify threats, it would actively hunt down and expose organizations that operated like Tyler's, turning their own tactics against them. I accepted the position, and within 6 months, Strategic Defense Consulting was operational with offices in Austin, Dallas, and Houston. Our first client was a biotechnology company in San Antonio that suspected they were being targeted by infiltration attempts similar to Tyler's method. Within 3 weeks, my team had identified 2 consulting firms that were conducting coordinated campaigns against the company's female executives, using fabricated performance concerns and manufactured crisis scenarios to justify termination recommendations. The case became our calling card, demonstrating that Tyler's methods were still being used throughout the industry by other organizations that had learned from his playbook. Our success in exposing and dismantling that operation led to a flood of requests from companies that had experienced unexplained leadership turnover or sudden performance crises among their executive team. But the most satisfying aspect of building Strategic Defense Consulting was the opportunity to work directly with the women who had been targeted by Tyler's network. Linda Vasquez became our director of victim advocacy, helping other women understand that their professional setbacks might not have been their fault. Dr. Sarah Chen, a former pharmaceutical executive who had been driven out of her position through tactics identical to Tyler's, joined as our Director of Investigation Services. Together, we developed a systematic approach to identifying and combating corporate espionage that turned the infiltrators' own methods against them. We created false consulting opportunities to expose firms that were operating beyond ethical boundaries. We developed digital surveillance techniques that could detect coordinated campaigns against specific executives. We built databases that tracked the movement of suspicious consultants between companies and identified patterns that suggested systematic targeting. Within 2 years, Strategic Defense Consulting had exposed and dismantled 7 organizations that were operating variations of Tyler's scheme. Our work had protected more than 200 executives from targeted attacks and saved an estimated $50 million in prevented damages and avoided litigation costs. The recognition came from unexpected quarter. Harvard Business School invited me to develop a case study program about corporate espionage prevention. The Federal Bureau of Investigation asked me to consult on white-collar crime investigations involving business fraud and systematic harassment. The Texas state legislature passed a resolution honoring my work in protecting the integrity of the state's technology industry. But the most meaningful recognition came from Tyler himself, in the form of a letter delivered to my office 2.5 years into his federal prison sentence. Unlike his previous desperate attempts at communication, this letter was different. Shorter, more direct, and surprisingly honest about what he had become. Emma, the letter began, I know you have no reason to read this, and even less reason to believe anything I said. But I wanted you to know that my time in federal prison has given me the opportunity to understand, for the first time, the scope of what I did to you and to the other women my organization targeted. I spent years telling myself that I was conducting legitimate business operations, that my targeting of successful women was based on objective performance concerns rather than systematic discrimination. I convinced myself that my personal feelings about our relationship didn't influence my professional recommendations, that everything I did was justified by sound business strategy. I was lying to myself as much as I was lying to everyone else. The truth is that I couldn't accept that you had built a better life without me. I couldn't tolerate the idea that leaving me had been the right decision for your career and your happiness. I used my professional skills and resources to wage a campaign of psychological warfare against you because I was too immature and too damaged to accept that you had outgrown the relationship we had shared. What makes this even more inexcusable is that I didn't stop with you. I systematically targeted other successful women because destroying careers had become a source of satisfaction for me. I convinced myself that I was leveling an unfair playing field, but the reality is that I was using my privilege and resources to punish women for achieving success that I felt threatened by. I know that an apology from me is meaningless at this point. I know that nothing I say can undo the damage I caused or restore the careers I destroyed. But I wanted you to know that your decision to fight back, to expose what I was doing, and to ensure that I faced consequences for my actions, probably saved dozens of other women from experiencing what I put you through. I will be in federal prison for the next 16 years, assuming I serve my full sentence. When I am released, I will be 52 years old, with a criminal record that will make it impossible for me to work in consulting or business strategy ever again. My professional reputation is destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery, and the financial penalties from the civil judgments will ensure that I will never accumulate significant assets or wealth. I am telling you this not to seek sympathy, but to acknowledge that the consequences you ensured I would face were appropriate and necessary. I represented a threat to successful women throughout the business community, and that threat needed to be eliminated. The consulting firm you have built, the work you are doing to protect other people from organizations like mine, represents the best possible outcome from the nightmare I created. You have transformed personal trauma into a mission that protects other people from experiencing similar attacks. I will never contact you again after this letter. I wanted to acknowledge what you accomplished and to express genuine admiration for the person you became after our relationship ended. The Emma Rodriguez who is now protecting other women from corporate predators is someone I never could have imagined when we were together, and someone I certainly never deserved to know. Tyler Matthews. I read that letter 3 times before filing it away in a secure cabinet in my office. It wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation. Tyler would never be someone I could trust or respect, and his crimes had caused too much damage for personal apologies to matter. But it was acknowledgement, both of the severity of what he had done and of the significance of what I had built in response to his attack. The letter also represented something else. Proof that systematic abusers could be held accountable for their actions when their victims were willing to fight back strategically and persistently. Tyler's admission that my response had probably saved other women from similar attacks validated every difficult decision I had made during the investigation and prosecution process. More importantly, it confirmed that the work I was doing through strategic defense consulting was having the intended impact. The consulting firm I had built wasn't just protecting individual executives from targeted attacks, it was changing the cost-benefit analysis for organizations that operated like Tyler. The risk of exposure and prosecution was now significant enough to deter many potential perpetrators from attempting similar operations. 5 years after Tyler's arrest, Strategic Defense Consulting had grown into a national organization with offices in 8 cities and a team of 47 investigators, advocates, and analysts. We had developed training programs for corporate boards, created early warning systems for detecting infiltration attempts, and established industry standards that made it much more difficult for organizations like Tyler's to operate without detection. The personal cost of building this mission had been significant. The work required me to relive traumatic experiences regularly, as I helped other victims understand and process what had happened to them. It demanded constant vigilance and strategic thinking, as the organizations we were combating adapted their methods in response to our countermeasures, but the personal rewards were even greater. I had transformed the worst experience of my life into a career that provided protection and justice for people who had suffered similar attacks. I had built something meaningful from the ashes of Tyler's betrayal, creating a legacy that would continue protecting people long after my own involvement ended. The irony was that Tyler's systematic campaign to destroy my career had ultimately led to the creation of something far more powerful and influential than anything I had accomplished at Innovate Tech. His attacks had forced me to develop skills and insights that I never would have acquired through traditional career advancement. His betrayal had revealed strengths and capabilities that I hadn't known I possessed. On the 5th anniversary of Tyler's arrest, I stood once again in a conference room filled with business leaders, this time delivering the closing address at the National Conference on Corporate Ethics and Executive Protection. The audience included prosecutors, investigators, corporate attorneys, and executives from hundreds of companies that had implemented protection protocols based on our research and recommendations. But it also included more than 100 women, whose careers had been saved through our interventions, along with dozens of men, who had been targeted by similar schemes. These were people who had been able to continue building their professional lives, because organizations like Tyler's were no longer able to operate with impunity. Corporate espionage and systematic harassment represent threats to the fundamental principles of merit-based advancement and ethical business competition. I told the audience that day, when we allow these practices to continue unchecked, we undermine the integrity of our entire economic system and create environments where success is determined by political manipulation rather than professional competence. But we have also proven that these threats can be identified, exposed, and eliminated when we approach them with the same systematic rigor that the perpetrators use to conduct their attacks.
We have demonstrated that organizations built on deception and intimidation are ultimately vulnerable to investigation and accountability. Most importantly, we have shown that the people who are targeted by these operations possess the strength and intelligence necessary to not only survive the attacks, but to transform their experiences into missions that protect other people from similar threats. The conference concluded with the announcement of new federal legislation that would provide additional protections for whistleblowers who expose corporate espionage operations, and strengthen penalties for organizations that engage in systematic harassment of business executives. The legislation was named the Corporate Executive Protection Act, and it had been inspired directly by the cases we had developed through strategic defense consulting. As I left the conference that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from Tyler's boardroom ambush to national recognition as a leader in corporate protection and business ethics. The path had been longer, more difficult and more transformative than anything I could have imagined when Tyler first walked back into my life with his strategic advisor credentials and his hidden agenda. But it had also been worth every challenge, every setback, and every moment of doubt. Tyler Matthews had set out to destroy my career and prove that leaving him had been a mistake. Instead, he had forced me to discover capabilities I never knew I possessed, and to build something far more meaningful than anything our relationship could have produced. The consulting firm I had created would continue operating long after I moved on to other challenges. The protection protocols we had developed would shield future generations of executives from the kind of systematic targeting that Tyler had perfected. The legislation we had inspired would provide legal frameworks that made corporate espionage operations significantly more difficult and dangerous to conduct. Tyler would remain in federal prison for 11 more years, his professional reputation permanently destroyed, and his financial assets permanently forfeited. When he was eventually released, he would enter a world where the methods he had once used so effectively were now well understood and actively monitored by organizations like the one I had built. But more than anything else, Tyler's ultimate failure proved something that every victim of systematic harassment needed to understand. Abusers derive their power from their victims' isolation, fear, and silence. When those victims find the courage to fight back systematically and strategically, when they transform personal trauma into missions that protect other people, when they refuse to be intimidated into surrender, the abusers discover that all their apparent power was built on foundations that couldn't withstand sustained resistance. I had learned that lesson the hard way, but I had learned it completely. And now, through strategic defense consulting and the hundreds of people we had trained and protected, that lesson was being taught to a new generation of business leaders who would never have to face the kind of coordinated attack that Tyler had launched against me. That, more than any personal vindication or professional success, was the true victory in this long war. Tyler Matthews had intended to break me, but instead he had accidentally created his own worst nightmare. Someone with the knowledge, resources, and determination necessary to systematically hunt down and eliminate people exactly like him. The future belonged to the people who understood that systematic abuse could be systematically defeated, and I was proud to be one of the leaders showing them how to do it. The morning of Tyler's sentencing hearing arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made Austin look like a postcard. I stood outside the federal courthouse, watching lawyers and journalists stream through the security checkpoints, knowing that in a few hours the legal chapter of this nightmare would finally close. The past 4 years had transformed me from a product manager fighting for her career into a nationally recognized expert on corporate espionage, but today felt like the real ending of the story that had started in that boardroom when Tyler first tried to destroy my life. James Rivera met me at the courthouse steps, carrying the same leather briefcase he had brought to our first meeting years ago. "Emma, are you ready for this?" he asked, his expression mixing professional satisfaction with genuine concern for my well-being. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure what ready meant in this context. Tyler's guilty plea had eliminated the need for a trial, sparing me from having to relive the worst moments of his campaign against me in open court. But the sentencing hearing would still require me to deliver a victim impact statement, to articulate for the judge and the public record exactly what Tyler's systematic attacks had cost me personally and professionally. The courtroom was packed with familiar faces from the business community, federal investigators who had worked the case, and reporters covering what had become a landmark prosecution in corporate crime. But the most meaningful presence was the group of women sitting together in the third row, the 47 executives whose careers had been targeted by Tyler's network, along with dozens more who had been affected by similar operations. Linda Vasquez caught my eye as I entered the courtroom and nodded with the kind of solidarity that comes from shared survival of systematic abuse. She had flown in from San Antonio specifically for Tyler's sentencing, even though her own case had been resolved through civil settlement months earlier. "Some moments require witnesses," she had told me when I asked why she was making the Tyler was already seated at the defendant's table when I took my place in the witness section. 4 years of federal incarceration had changed him in ways that went beyond the gray jumpsuit and the restraints around his wrist. The arrogant confidence that had once defined his presence in corporate settings had been replaced by something harder to read, not exactly humility, but a kind of defeated resignation that suggested he finally understood the magnitude of what he had done. His attorney, David Morrison, was a prominent white-collar defense lawyer who had been hired by Tyler's family after his original legal team had been dismissed for conflicts of interest. Morrison had spent months trying to negotiate a plea agreement that would reduce Tyler's sentence, arguing that his client had been a mid-level participant in a larger conspiracy rather than a primary architect of the corporate espionage network. The strategy had failed spectacularly when Ashley Carter's cooperation with federal investigators revealed the depth of Tyler's involvement in planning and executing the systematic targeting operation. Her recorded conversations and email communications had painted Tyler as someone who took genuine pleasure in destroying careers, someone who had elevated corporate sabotage from a business tactic to a form of psychological entertainment. Judge Patricia Rodriguez called the hearing to order with the kind of formal gravity that befitted the conclusion of a case that had exposed criminal activity across 14 states. She had presided over the entire prosecution with a combination of professional competence and obvious outrage at the scope of Tyler's network's activities. Matthews, you have pleaded guilty to charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, corporate espionage, racketeering, and systematic harassment. Judge Rodriguez began, reading from the case summary that had taken federal prosecutors 2 years to compile. These charges stem from your leadership role in a criminal organization that targeted successful executives, primarily women, for professional destruction through coordinated campaigns of sabotage, character assassination, and systematic intimidation. The formal language of the charges couldn't capture the human cost of Tyler's activities, but the numbers were staggering enough to convey the scope of the damage. 47 women had lost their positions as a direct result of Tyler's operation. An estimated $15 million in career earnings had been destroyed through his systematic campaigns. 12 companies had suffered significant financial losses due to the instability created by his infiltration efforts, but those statistics, as devastating as they were, didn't include the psychological trauma, the destroyed confidence, the relationships damaged by the stress of fighting invisible enemy, or the countless other women who had been deterred from pursuing leadership positions because they had witnessed what could happen to successful executives who attracted the wrong kind of attention. Prosecutor Maria Santos stood to present the government's sentencing recommendation, and her summary of Tyler's crimes was methodical and damning. Your Honor, Tyler Matthews operated a sophisticated criminal enterprise that weaponized legitimate business consulting practices against successful individuals who threatened his psychological need for dominance and control. His organization didn't just commit fraud, it systematically destroyed lives while disguising criminal activity as strategic business advice. Santos walked through the evidence that had been compiled during the investigation, including Tyler's own communications, describing his targets as obstacles to be eliminated, and his recorded statements about the satisfaction he derived from watching careers collapse under his orchestrated attack. She emphasized that Tyler's crimes hadn't been motivated by financial gain alone, but by a desire to punish successful women for achieving positions that he felt they didn't deserve. Mr. Matthews specifically targeted women who had rejected him professionally or personally, using his consulting credentials to gain access to their professional environments, and then systematically undermining their careers through fabricated performance concerns and manufactured crises. Santos continued, "This wasn't business competition, it was predatory behavior disguised as strategic consulting." When Santos finished her presentation, Judge Rodriguez called for victim impact statement. Linda Vasquez was the first to speak, and her testimony established the emotional baseline for everything that followed. Your Honor, I lost more than my job when Tyler Matthews targeted my company, Linda began, her voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of speaking publicly about her experience. I lost my confidence, my trust in business relationships, and my belief that professional success was based on merit rather than political manipulation. For 3 years, I believed that my termination was evidence of my own inadequacy, rather than the result of a systematic campaign designed to destroy my reputation. Linda described the months of gaslighting she had endured, the gradual erosion of her authority within her own company, and the carefully orchestrated incidents that had been used to justify her eventual termination. But she also described the process of rebuilding her career and her sense of professional identity after learning that she had been the victim of corporate espionage rather than a failed executive. Tyler Matthews stole 3 years of my life and nearly destroyed my belief in my own abilities, Linda concluded. But his prosecution and conviction have restored my faith that systematic predators can be held accountable for their actions when their victims have the courage to fight back. 3 more women delivered similar statements, each describing the devastating personal cost of Tyler's attacks and the long process of recovery that had followed. But when Judge Rodriguez called my name, I knew that my statement needed to be different. The other victims had suffered in isolation, not understanding what was happening to them until the federal investigation revealed the coordinated nature of Tyler's operation. I had been able to fight back in real time, which created both obligations and opportunities that the others hadn't experienced. I approached the podium carrying notes I had written and rewritten dozens of times, trying to capture not just the damage Tyler had caused, but the broader implications of what his prosecution meant for corporate accountability and executive protection. Your Honor, Tyler Matthews didn't just attack my career, he weaponized intimate knowledge from our personal relationship to conduct psychological warfare against my professional success. I began. He used his understanding of my vulnerabilities, my fears, and my aspirations to craft attacks that were designed to cause maximum emotional damage, while maintaining plausible deniability about his motivation. I described the escalating pattern of Tyler's campaign, from his initial infiltration of Innovate Tech, to his attempts to destroy my reputation, through industry media to his threats against my family member. But I also described the moment when I realized that fighting back wasn't just about protecting myself, it was about protecting every other woman who might become Tyler's target in the future. Tyler Matthews represented a particular kind of predator that our business community had never learned to recognize or defend against. He used legitimate consulting credentials and professional networks to gain access to companies where he could identify and eliminate executives who threatened his psychological need for dominance. His crimes weren't opportunistic, they were systematic, calculated, and designed to have lasting impact on his victims' careers and psychological well-being. I looked directly at Tyler as I delivered the most important part of my statement. But Tyler Matthews made one critical miscalculation when he targeted me. He assumed that I would respond to his attacks the same way I had responded to his manipulation during our relationship, with self-doubt, emotional confusion, and eventual surrender. He didn't account for the possibility that surviving his betrayal had made me stronger, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous than the person he remembered. The courtroom was completely silent as I described the investigation that had exposed Tyler's network, the federal case that had dismantled his organization, and the consulting firm I had built to protect other executives from similar attacks. I explained how Tyler's campaign against me had ultimately led to the development of industry-wide protection protocols and federal legislation that would prevent future operations like his. Tyler Matthews intended to destroy my career as proof that leaving him had been a mistake, I said, reaching the conclusion I had practiced until the words felt like natural speech. Instead, he forced me to discover capabilities I didn't know I possessed, and to build something far more meaningful than anything our relationship could have produced. His systematic campaign against me created the very person who would ultimately expose and eliminate the threat he represented. I returned to my seat knowing that I had said everything necessary, that the formal record now contained a complete account of both the damage Tyler had caused and the response his attacks had generated. But I also knew that the real impact of my statement wasn't just about Tyler's sentencing. It was about establishing a public record that would help other victims understand that systematic abuse could be systematically defeated. Tyler's attorney presented a brief statement asking for leniency based on his client's cooperation with ongoing investigations and his apparent remorse for his action. Morrison emphasized Tyler's middle-class background, his previously clean criminal record,
and the financial devastation his family had experienced as a result of his conviction. But Judge Rodriguez's response made it clear that she understood the broader implications of Tyler's crimes and the importance of sending a message that would deter similar operations in the future. Matthews, your crimes represent a particularly insidious form of predatory behavior that exploits legitimate business relationships to cause systematic harm to successful individuals, she began. You didn't just commit fraud, you weaponized professional consulting practices against people who trusted your credentials and expertise. Judge Rodriguez emphasized that Tyler's targeting of successful women represented a form of discrimination that was especially harmful, because it was disguised as objective business analysis. She noted that his systematic approach to destroying careers had required sophisticated planning and coordination, making his crimes significantly more serious than opportunistic fraud or harassment. Your actions have undermined trust in consulting relationships throughout the business community and created an environment where successful executives, particularly women, must now defend themselves against threats they may not even recognize. Judge Rodriguez continued, the psychological warfare you conducted against your victims represents a level of calculated cruelty that demands a substantial period of incarceration. The sentence was 23 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation and permanent forfeiture of all assets connected to Tyler's consulting operation. Tyler would also be required to pay restitution totaling $47 million to his victims and the companies that had been damaged by his activity. Tyler's reaction to the sentence was minimal, a slight slumping of his shoulders and a brief closing of his eyes, as if he had been expecting something even worse. His attorney immediately filed notice of appeal, though legal experts had already indicated that Tyler's guilty plea made successful appeal unlikely. As the hearing concluded and Tyler was led away in restraints, I felt something I hadn't expected, not satisfaction or vindication, but a kind of profound relief that comes from completing a difficult journey. The formal legal process was finally over, but the real work of protecting other people from similar attacks would continue for years to come. Outside the courthouse, I was surrounded by reporters seeking comment on Tyler's sentence and the broader implications of the case for corporate security and executive protection. But the questions I found most meaningful came from the women who had traveled to Austin to witness Tyler's sentence. Emma, what happens next? Asked Dr. Sarah Chen, the pharmaceutical executive who had become our Director of Investigation Services at Strategic Defense Consulting. Tyler's organization is dismantled, but there are probably others using similar methods. She was right, of course. Tyler's conviction represented the end of one criminal enterprise, but the techniques he had perfected were already being copied by other organizations that understood the profitability of systematic corporate espionage. Our work at Strategic Defense Consulting had identified at least 12 other operations that were using variations of Tyler's methods to target executives across different industries. The work continues, I replied, looking at the group of women who had survived Tyler's attacks and transformed their experiences into missions that protected other people. Tyler's conviction proves that these operations can be exposed and dismantled when victims are willing to fight back strategically. But prevention requires constant vigilance and continued investment in protection protocol. 3 months after Tyler's sentencing, Strategic Defense Consulting received its largest contract ever, a comprehensive security assessment for a consortium of Fortune 500 companies that wanted to implement industry-wide protection standards against corporate espionage. The contract represented 18 months of work across 12 cities, with a budget that would allow us to expand our team and develop more sophisticated detection capability. But the most rewarding aspect of our expanded operations was the opportunity to work directly with corporate boards and executive teams to build protection systems before attacks occurred, rather than responding to damage after infiltration had already succeeded. We were becoming proactive rather than reactive, teaching companies to recognize and prevent systematic targeting before it could cause career destruction. The training programs we developed became standard curriculum at business schools and corporate leadership programs throughout the Southwest. Our research on systematic targeting techniques was cited in federal legislation and international business ethics guidelines. The protection protocols we designed were implemented by companies across multiple industries, creating a network of organizations that could identify and respond to coordinated attacks against their leadership team. 1 year after Tyler's sentencing, I received an invitation that represented the ultimate validation of the mission I had built from the wreckage of his attack. The Federal Bureau of Investigation asked me to establish a training program for agents investigating corporate espionage cases, using the techniques we had developed to expose Tyler's network as the foundation for a comprehensive law enforcement curriculum. The FBI training facility in Quantico felt like an entirely different world from the corporate boardrooms where I had spent most of my career, but the principles of systematic investigation and strategic response translated perfectly to federal law enforcement. The agents I trained would go on to investigate dozens of similar cases, using the methods we had pioneered to identify and dismantle criminal organizations that operated like Tyler's network. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The Harvard Business School case study program that had featured Tyler's prosecution as an example of corporate crime prevention invited me to become a visiting professor, teaching graduate students about the intersection of business ethics, corporate security, and executive protection. Standing in a Harvard classroom, presenting case studies based on Tyler's systematic targeting operations to future business leaders, felt like the completion of a journey that had begun with Tyler's betrayal and led through years of investigation, prosecution, and mission building to this moment of educational impact. Corporate espionage represents one of the most serious threats to merit-based advancement in modern business, I told my students during the first class of the semester. When systematic predators are allowed to operate without detection or consequences, they undermine the fundamental principles of competitive business and create environments where success is determined by political manipulation rather than professional competence. The students in that classroom included future CEOs, entrepreneurs, and corporate leaders who would face decisions about consulting relationships, executive protection, and organizational security throughout their career. Teaching them to recognize and respond to systematic targeting represented an investment in preventing future Tyler Matthews from succeeding in their destructive mission. 5 years after Tyler's sentencing, Strategic Defense Consulting had grown into a national organization, with offices in 15 cities and a team of more than 80 investigators, advocates, and protection specialists. We had prevented an estimated 200 targeting operations, protected more than 500 executives from systematic attacks, and contributed to federal legislation that had resulted in the prosecution of 43 additional criminal organizations. Tyler remained in federal prison, serving his sentence at a medium-security facility in Colorado. He had lost his appeals and would not be eligible for parole for 17 more years. When he was eventually released, he would enter a world where the methods he had once used so effectively were now well understood and actively monitored by organizations like the one I had built. But more importantly, Tyler's conviction had established legal precedents and investigative techniques that had fundamentally changed the risk calculation for anyone considering similar operations. The cost of conducting systematic corporate espionage had increased dramatically, while the likelihood of detection and prosecution had risen to levels that made such operations economically and legally unsustainable. The consulting firm I had built would continue operating long after my own involvement ended, protecting future generations of executives from the kind of coordinated attacks that Tyler had perfected. The protection protocols we had developed would shield talented professionals from systematic targeting, allowing them to focus on building their careers rather than defending against invisible enemies. But the true victory wasn't just about preventing future Tyler Matthews from succeeding in their destructive missions. It was about proving that systematic abuse could be systematically defeated when victims found the courage to fight back strategically and persistently. Tyler Matthews had set out to destroy my career and prove that successful women who rejected him would pay a permanent price for their independence. Instead, he had created exactly the kind of strategic, determined, and systematically minded opponent who could expose and eliminate the threat he represented. The irony was perfect, and the justice was complete. Tyler's attempt to weaponize his professional skills against me had forced me to develop superior skills and use them to build something far more powerful than anything he had ever accomplished. His systematic campaign to destroy my life had become the foundation for a mission that would protect thousands of other lives from similar attacks. Standing in my office at Strategic Defense Consulting, looking out at the Austin skyline where this entire nightmare had begun, I understood that Tyler's ultimate failure represented something larger than personal vindication. It proved that abusers who rely on systematic intimidation and manipulation are ultimately vulnerable to systematic resistance and strategic counterattack. The future belonged to the people who understood that lesson, and I was proud to be one of the leaders teaching them how to apply it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.